In this video we are going to travel again, not only regionally, but we are also going to travel in time because I'm taking you to the Vienna of the 1800s. I would like to tell you more about a very famous dress of the time, maybe one of the most famous dresses ever. It is the star dress worn by Austrian Empress Elisabeth, who you may also know under the name of Empress Sissy. And before I dive into the details, this is a non-sponsored video, I'm just sharing my personal opinion and my research here. Now, who is this Empress Sissy or Empress Elisabeth? If you have traveled to Austria and particularly Vienna, you for sure came across the postcards, the snow globes, the dresses, even the hair accessories in the shape of stars. And until today, Empress Sissy or Empress Elisabeth has been a major driver for tourism, not only in Vienna, but in Austria overall. And this is due to the many myths around this beautiful empress. She was said to be one of the most beautiful women of her time. There have been many books written about her, there were many movies, and she is especially famous or known to most people, especially in the German-speaking countries, because of a movie series from the 1950s about this Empress Elisabeth, starring Romy Schneider, the young Romy Schneider, who later became a very famous actress in France. Unfortunately, her role of Empress Sissy very often overshadowed her career. And also most people think they know about Empress Elisabeth because of these movies. Some people actually call these movies a bit kitschy, but this is personal views. Fact is that very often historically they are not entirely correct. I'm not going into the details here whether Empress Elisabeth and her mother-in-law really liked each other or not. We are focusing on the fashion here, and we are focusing here on this very famous star dress. Elisabeth was not Austrian. She was born in Munich in 1837 and she grew up in Bavaria. Very often the family spent time in their summer residence in Possenhofen. Most people who have watched the movies know about Possenhofen, that the family loved to be outdoors. And while the marriage of the parents was not entirely happy, Elisabeth learned something from them, and this was the passion for nature, also the passion for sports. And this was very unlike all the other aristocratic ladies, especially in the Viennese court, because an aristocratic young lady was not expected to be outdoors and hike up a mountain. She was expected to be rather indoors, also maybe do activities like embroidery. So Elisabeth was very different from that. She learned that especially from her father. And this was also a big transition that she was expected to make when she married Francis Joseph I and moved to Vienna. And this was also something that she was going to struggle with. Why did she enjoy so many freedoms despite being aristocratic? The reason was that her father did not have an official function at the court in Munich, so they could be in Possenhofen and actually live this rather free life, which was a bit unusual for the time for aristocrats, but also it was part of the charm of Empress Elisabeth in the long run. Elisabeth married Francis Joseph when she was 15, and it is said that it was a love marriage. The reason is, or one of the reasons is, that Francis Joseph had already refused to marry quite a few suitors, and then he met his cousin in Bad Ischl. It was kind of also organized by his mother, and he immediately fell in love. From the research that I did, we can assume that this may have been reciprocated, that it was also love from her side. But in general, I would like to say she was very young. She was only 15. He was 7 years older. So we never really know for sure. I think she was a bit naive. She did not really know what that move to Vienna or marrying the Austrian emperor would mean for her life in the long run. As I mentioned before, I'm focusing here on the fashion only, but there's one thing that we need to understand about Empress Elisabeth to also understand her fashion choices and also to understand the star dress. Because throughout her life, Elisabeth struggled with her mental health. One reason probably was that she had to move from Bavaria, away from her family, from the freedom to the strict Viennese court, and she always struggled with that. And her mental health gradually worsened after the tragic death of her son Rudolf in 1889. And then she herself also died from a very tragic death because she was killed in 1898 at the promenade of Lake Geneva. If you travel to Geneva, there's actually still a statue of Empress Elisabeth at that spot at the promenade by the lake. Elisabeth's wardrobe was centered around elegance and precious materials, fine materials. Needless to say, this is the wardrobe of an empress, and it also focused a lot on accentuating her body shape. You may know she was very proud of her slim figure. At a height of 1.72 m, she only had a waist circumference of 51 centimeters. So if I calculated correctly in feet, she's 5'8" and it's 20 inches. Needless to say, she was the empress, so a lot of media reports centered around her. Very often they spoke about her beauty, and this also involved her dresses, but she was actually not a fashion icon at the time, or not the most important fashion icon. For sure, she was an inspiration for some, but there were others that were actually the trendsetters. One was, for example, Pauline Fürstin Metternich, who was married to the ambassador to France, the Austrian ambassador to France, and she was a client of Charles Frederick Worth, the first couturier. I'm going to mention him a bit later, so remember that he is quite important also for Elisabeth. And when she and her husband returned to Vienna from their posting, she organized these lavish charity events, and she loved to show off all the fashion from Paris. So she definitely was one of the trendsetters, but that didn't mean that Elisabeth was not interested in fashion. She was very much interested in it, and she also followed fashion trends of the time. And you can also see in her wardrobe how she actually took those trends up. And one thing we need to remember is something that I mentioned in my video about Pierre Balmain and Queen Sirikit of Thailand. As the Empress of Austria, Elisabeth's wardrobe had a function that went beyond the mere fashion. So you could express certain things through your fashion, and you will see that also the star dress stood for more than just a mere fashion trend. So I mentioned before how much Elisabeth struggled with the life at the Viennese court. For her, it was a culture shock, and it was also a culture shock for the people at the court. The Viennese court was very strict, and also the ladies at the Viennese court, they thought that Elisabeth's upbringing in Bavaria was probably a bit crude, we could say, and they also made sure that she felt that they didn't think she was good enough for being the Austrian empress. So we have these things, and this was a struggle for her, but gradually also her character developed. Let's not forget, she was only 15 when she married the emperor, so she was very young. So of course she also matured. So why am I telling you all this? At first I say I focus on the fashion only. Now I give you some background about the gossip at the Viennese court. We need to know this to understand not only that dress, but the fashion choices of the empress, and also how her style developed over time, because she expressed herself through fashion. In the beginning, she was this young girl. She looked very much down to earth. She was natural, not necessarily a beauty icon yet. Some people even said she wasn't even that beautiful. You could also see that with her fashion choices. Over time, she gained more confidence. Some people attribute this to her travels. And then you can see that this beauty aspect became more important also for her. Maybe this was her expression of confidence, and then she's also receiving the positive feedback. And then over time also the mental health aspect comes in and is reflected in the clothing. I already mentioned her son before. After he passed away, she decided to only wear black, for example. And even the star dress, this very famous dress, stands for much more than fashion. This is the dress that you may have seen on the postcards that I mentioned before. It is from a portrait by Franz Xaver Winterhalter. The Empress was 28 years old, and there are so many things that were taken from that painting. Not only the painting itself was printed on postcards, but you can still buy the hair accessories. In 1996, Barbie had a limited edition of Empress Elisabeth, and very often I still see tourists coming to Vienna during ball season, and then they dress up like Empress Elisabeth in that dress. So until today, this dress is the basis of tourism, the blueprint for so many souvenirs, kitschy souvenirs sometimes, but it is actually much more than this, because it stands for a milestone in Empress Elisabeth's life. It is a dress that she wore at a time where she decided to actively take herself out of all the public duties as an empress. And while this sounds quite easy, this was actually not, because she married Francis Joseph, and this meant she had to represent. This was her job, this was her duty. that she had to travel with him, that she had to attend functions. But over time it became more and more difficult for Elisabeth to do this. Remember, I said before, she always loved her freedom. And there's a letter from 1865 where she writes to her husband and says that she demands that all the matters regarding the children can only be decided on by herself. And also when it comes to where she has to be or where she wants to be, she is the only person who can decide that. What did that mean? She basically told him in that letter she does not want to represent anymore, she does not want to travel with him to these official trips anymore, she wants to withdraw herself from that life. Francis Joseph gave in. It is said that he loved her, so probably he just wanted her to be happy. And because he said, okay, because he decided she can do that, nobody else was allowed to criticize this decision. So this letter was from 1865. She decides to withdraw herself. And then the painting is from 1863-64, and there's also written proof that she attended certain functions around the time until about 1865-66. Where she was seen in that dress. And we could even say that this dress was one of the dresses that she wore when she already made that decision to step back from these official functions, when she wanted to withdraw herself from this official role as the Empress of Austria. Now let's come back to the dress itself. What did it look like? Unfortunately, this dress did not survive, and this is actually not an exception when it comes to the wardrobe of the Habsburgs, because there are many reasons for that. Sometimes the dresses of the empress were given to the church, for example, and then they were turned into clothing with a liturgical function. Sometimes the dresses were given to relatives or to the ladies at the court, and also these people then altered the clothing, very often also for the reason that, as I said before, Empress Elisabeth was very, very slim, and not many women were that slim, so they had to change the clothing, and then very often you can't even tell that this was a dress that the Empress herself actually wore before. Sometimes the clothes also found a new purpose within the family. For example, some dresses were cut up and then turned into children's clothing, or for example for clothing for christening ceremonies. So all of this is one reason why there are not many surviving outfits of the Habsburgs, and when you go to the museums in Vienna, very often you can only see the reconstructions. And the last reason is a practical one. If you have followed this year's exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, you know that also clothes can decay, or they do decay. They are in touch with the human skin, with air, sunlight, sometimes humidity, and then they just break down, and very often to a degree that we just can't wear them anymore. And very often if it's stored and then we want to take it out of the storage, we lift it up and then it breaks down in thousands of pieces. I just recently had this with a jacket which was vegan leather, i.e. plastic, and I hadn't worn this jacket for a very long time, and then I walked around wearing it, thankfully at home, and suddenly I saw a trail of small black things behind me, and I realized that basically that garment was decaying or breaking down because it just had reached the end of its lifespan. That's just the way it is. How can we then learn more about clothing that doesn't exist anymore? We have to look into written sources or also paintings. And in the case of the star dress, it is the painting by Franz Xaver Winterhalter. And he was very famous for painting aristocratic ladies, monarchs. He also painted Empress Eugenie from France. He also painted Queen Victoria. So of course he was also worthy then of painting Empress Elisabeth. And another plus point for Winterhalter was that he was very known for bringing out the beauty of the people he painted. And what is an advantage for historians, also fashion historians, he was very, very good at painting textiles. When you look at his paintings, you see the intricate embroidery, you can see tulle, very fine garments, which is a very good skill, and it is also an advantage from a fashion history perspective. So thanks to his painting, we know that the dress was first around and also what it looked like. And the second step is written information from the time, where, for example, newspapers or magazines write about the dresses, the garments, or also letters of family members. And I have read many books about Empress Elisabeth, also many articles. And one of the books that I read for this video was by Katrin Unterreiner, Oh, wie schön sie ist, So if you translate it, it would be, oh, how beautiful she is. I think this is only published in German. So if you speak German, I highly recommend this because it's not only about the fashion and the garments of Empress Elisabeth, it also shows you a lot about her personality, her development. And in her book, Unterreiner quotes from a fashion magazine from the monarchy, from the times of Empress Elisabeth, where this fashion magazine describes the dress. In a lot of detail, actually. They write about the white tulle. They say it featured these silver stars. It's actually interesting that it was silver stars because very often in these contemporary souvenir things, the stars are gold. They also wrote about the hair accessories, the stars in her hair. So we now have this famous portrait. We also have the written information. There are also documents by family members, for example, Elisabeth's mother-in-law, where she described the dress. So we know not only what the dress looked like, but we also know that Elisabeth was wearing that not only in the studio, when Winterhalter painted her, which was sometimes usual for aristocrats. She also wore this dress for functions, and not only one function. She wore this at multiple functions. For example, she also wore it at the wedding of her brother, where some people said she even stole the show of the bride. But this is actually a bit misleading because in defense of the Empress, she only wore that dress on the second day after the actual wedding ceremony. So it was not really stealing the show of the bride, but this is again gossip and not fashion, but I still wanted to mention it here. And these written documents also show us not only what that dress looked like, it also is proof that she wore it at this time, 1863, 1865, at some functions. And it also shows that it corresponds with the painting, but also with the letter she sent to her husband when she said, I'm going to withdraw myself from the official duties. I want to be free. And now a very important question, who actually made this dress? And maybe you remember I mentioned Charles Frederick Worth before, and it's not 100% confirmed, but it can be assumed that this dress was made by the first couturier. So who was Charles Frederick Worth? I'm not going to focus on his biography here. This would go beyond this video. I'm just going to focus on some details. But if you want to learn more about Charles Frederick Worth and his development as a designer and why he is called the first couturier, let me know in the comments below and I will prepare a separate video. Charles Frederick Worth opened his store in 1858, and it was special because at the time most tailors only worked made to order. So clients came to their studios and then they had something made. But Worth was actually quite innovative. He already had some kind of collection, some pre-made garments that his clients could choose from, and then he made it for them. So this was the first innovation. He also put his label into the garment. So that's why he then owned this name of becoming the father of haute couture, the first couturier. Why did the Austrian empress choose a Parisian couturier? She could have chosen so many other people. One reason was that at the time Worth was already very famous, not only in the fashion industry, but overall. He exported his designs to America, also to other places overseas. Maybe you have watched my video about how India influenced fashion. I said that the House of Worth created the famous peacock dress for the British Viceroy in India. So for sure, Empress Elisabeth also knew about this because she was very much interested in fashion, and probably she also wanted to show that she was part of the Worth circle, that she could afford the dresses and that she's also fashionable. We know that she followed quite a few trends set by Worth. For example, she swapped the round crinoline to an oval-shaped one. She also followed his trend when he chopped off the length of the skirt to ankle length, very daring at the time. But this is something that Unterreiner mentioned in her book, that Empress Elisabeth did that. And another reason was his cuts and shapes. He was very famous for accentuating the body shape. And as I said before, Elisabeth liked to show off her slim body shape. So this was another factor why she probably chose Charles Frederick Worth. But now you will say, I mentioned before that it's not 100% confirmed that it was Worth. How do we know? The thing with the garment is, first of all, the garment disappeared. So even if there was this famous label by Charles Frederick Worth in there, we would not know. But again, we need to look into the written sources in the archives, and Unterreiner gives these sources in her book. And according to her, there are several invoices issued by Charles Frederick Worth, the House of Worth, to the Austrian or Viennese court. And these invoices show different amounts. For example, they range between roughly 3,500 to 6,800 French francs. So the problem is we have the amounts, but we can't really tell which dress was which amount, but we can make some assumptions because these amounts are quite high compared to average designs by Charles Frederick Worth. According to Unterreiner, an average design cost around 1,500 French francs at the time. So we can assume that this was rather dresses for gala dinners, gala functions or balls. I would like to put this into the context of the time so that we can understand how expensive these clothes were. Let's look at France, because this is where Charles Frederick Worth was based, and he also issued the invoices in French francs, so it's easier to compare this. A factory worker in France in 1870, which is roughly the time where Elisabeth wore that dress, he earned about 2,500 French francs per year. So when we now compare this, 3,500 to 6,800 French francs, this is about 1.5 times to almost or over 2.5 times the annual salary of a factory worker. So just also put this into the context of the time. So we have the invoices, but another hint why it could be worth is the design itself, because there was another star dress designed by him, which was worn by Virginia Oldoini, Contessa di Castiglione, very long name, in 1858. She was also the mistress of Napoleon III, so just a juicy detail on the side. And maybe Worth took this as a source of inspiration for his star dress for Empress Elisabeth. This is one option, so he has already designed a star dress and maybe this is a new version of it. The other option is that Elisabeth came up herself with the idea of the dress. There is a legend that she was inspired for this dress when she watched Die Zauberflöte, the magic flute by Mozart, and she saw the Queen of the Night, but there's no written proof of that. So maybe she was inspired by it, maybe she had this idea, we will actually never know because there's no proof for this. And this dress is actually more than just the dress itself. We could say that Worth created something like a Gesamtkunstwerk, because when most people think about Empress Elisabeth and the dress or this depiction of her, they don't really think about the dress, they think about the hair accessories, these stars that she was wearing in her hair. This was also a detail that we saw in the dress from 1858 for the Contessa. She also wore stars in her hair, so another link that might reconfirm Worth. So where did these come from? First of all, Elisabeth wore the dress with different styles of her hair. There is also a report where she paired it with a diamond tiara. So it's not only the way we know it from the painting, but because that painting is so famous, most people focus on these stars. And actually until today, you can buy knockoffs of these stars, but you can also get your piece of Elisabeth if you go to the jewelers that actually made it for the Empress, because it was two jewelers in Vienna who were official suppliers to the court. One was Rosé and Fischmeister and one was A.E. Köchert, and they designed versions of these stars. So Empress Elisabeth actually had more than one set, and she also had different variations. So the version by Rosé and Fischmeister was just a star with diamonds, and then also there was a similar version only using diamonds by Köchert, but there was also a version with a pearl in the center. So we see there were a lot of variations. We today only look at these details. Sometimes we mistake it for gold and not silver, so this is also something that was probably shaped by the books, the movies, and also the souvenirs that we see all the time. Unfortunately, the majority of the stars have disappeared. There are many rumors what happened to them, but one original star is still displayed in the Sissy Museum in Vienna. There's also an interesting story around it, or an adventure around it. In 1998, the star was stolen from the Sissy Museum, but it was then found again in 2010, and since then it has been back in the museum. Who came up with the idea of this hair accessory? Was it the jewelers, Elisabeth, Worth himself? We will never know. It may be likely that it was Worth, because we know that he very often advised his clients not only on the garments but also the accessories. Also, we know from this design that he made for the Contessa in 1858, also she was wearing stars in her hair. So it's not unlikely that Worth was the source of inspiration for this. And there's one interesting detail that I learned about this dress when I did the research for this video. We call it the star dress, but maybe it is not stars that are depicted on the dress. There is a theory that it is actually Edelweiss. Maybe you have seen Sound of Music, like so many people who don't live in Austria. Edelweiss is an alpine flower. Today it is protected, it is very delicate, it is white. And there's also this legend around Francis Joseph and Elisabeth that when he went hiking in the mountains and he found Edelweiss, he picked them and brought them back for his Elisabeth. So maybe the embroidery is not stars, it's delicate embroidery depicting Edelweiss. It is possible because it's quite fitting, the Austrian empress, the alpine flower, the nod to the love of her husband. So not entirely impossible. I find this really interesting, but this is another thing that, another mystery that yet needs to be resolved around a dress by Empress Elisabeth. And I have also reached the end of my video about this very famous dress. And now I would like to hear your view. Did you know about this dress? Have you visited Austria or have you seen this dress anywhere else? What do you think about this, or do you have any further questions about this dress or Empress Elisabeth? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you could hit that like button, and of course, if you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to my channel if you like my content. You can also head over to thepinklookbook.com for more fashion related articles, and you can also check out my fashion label Pelargona. And if you're interested in another famous dress that Empress Elisabeth used to wear, I have done another video about the fashion history of the dirndl, so you can also check that out. Thank you very much for watching this video, and see you in the next one.